Welcome to Mercersburg Mennonite Church's worship service. Yes, through this crisis, we've become an online community. But make no mistake, we are worshiping together. And I trust that as we worship, you will experience the love of Jesus. And when our time is done, that love you experience, you will share it with those around you. And so now let us enter this time of worship through song.
Worship Him now, how great, how awesome. Hello, church family. This is Jonathan Rotz, as you can tell, and I have the privilege of sharing a message with you here today. Thank you very much to Pastor David for the ability to do this. Good morning or afternoon, evening, whenever this may find you. And I would just like to thank you for taking some time out from these interesting days and weeks to really just stop and ponder about Jesus, about the meaning of him in our lives. So we've just come through the Easter season, and I have a few thoughts that I think you'll find not only interesting, but also very applicable for the time that we're in. I've entitled this message, A Tale of Two Brothers. And this is a little bit of a loose translation of the idea of brothers. But I want to talk to you about two disciples specifically. Now, a lot of us know, but for anybody that may not, a disciple is one of Jesus' students. And there were 12 disciples that were his closest trusted confidants, as well as his closest students, and I think it wouldn't be a stretch at all to say his closest friends. And today I want to talk with you about two of them. This is why it's a loose translation of brothers, but these men would have come together and had somewhat of a brotherhood. But the two disciples I want to speak to you about today are Peter and Judas. So I'll start off with Peter and a little bit of a brief introduction. Some of us know a lot of stories about Peter. There's actually a lot of things shared about Peter in the Gospels. He's actually in multiple Gospels, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. He is the first disciple that is mentioned when it talks about Jesus calling disciples. Him and his brother Andrew are called. You can read about it in Matthew 4:18, Mark 1:16, and Luke 5:3-8. Part of this calling was he was actually called out of being a fisherman. Now, a fisherman was a very common person in those days. He wasn't a scholar. He wasn't someone esteemed in government or business or things like that, but just a fisherman. So you can say he was a common man. And in fact, in the account in Luke 5:8, Peter says to Jesus, "Go away from me, Lord, for I'm a sinful man." I find this interesting because apparently Peter seems to have this understanding that he's very common, and he wouldn't know why Jesus, or from his vantage point, a rabbi, is calling him to come and follow. Now, the thing that I like about Peter is Peter was all in all the time. It didn't matter what he was doing. Peter was always engaged and ready to go full tilt. In Matthew 14:22-23, this is a great account where Jesus is actually walking across the water. And the disciples see him and they're scared because they think it's a ghost, because what else would be walking across the water, right? And Jesus calls out and says, "Do not be afraid." And Peter says back to Jesus after he declares who he is, Peter says, "Lord, if it's you, then call me and I'll come walk to you." And Jesus said, "Well, come." And the craziest thing happens. Peter gets out of the boat. And he actually starts walking on water. Now, a lot of times we go in this story and we come to the idea that Peter eventually takes his eyes off Jesus, starts looking at the wind and the waves, and starts to sink. Personally, I look at Peter walked on water. How cool is that? All in, all the time. In Matthew 16:13-23, Peter claims that Jesus is the Messiah. And Jesus actually esteems him for this and builds him up, but then in the very next passage, Jesus talks about how he has to go back to Jerusalem and he will die. And Peter says, "Absolutely never. I will make sure that doesn't happen." And Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan." And both of these things, kind of on the opposite sides of each, Jesus is telling Peter he's all in all the time. Peter goes in and he says, "You're the Messiah and I'll do anything for you." And then immediately tells Jesus that I will do anything for you. In fact, I will battle for you. And Jesus says, "You're standing in the way of God's plan." And then in John 13, 5 through 11, at the Last Supper, Jesus is washing his disciples' feet. And Peter at first says, "No, I'm the servant of you. There's no way I can have you wash my nasty feet." And Jesus says, "Well, if I don't wash you, you have no part of me." And just as Peter is all in all the time, he says, "Well, then, geez, if that's what it takes, then wash all of me, Lord. Every last bit." Which Jesus replies and says, "It doesn't have to be all of you. Not all of you is dirty. I only need to wash that part which is dirty." Not too far after that, in John 13, 36 through 38, Peter claims that he's going to be willing to fight for Jesus and lay down his life. But then Jesus predicts Peter's actual betrayal. Now, not to be overlooked, Peter, in a sense, fulfills this. Peter says, "Lord, I will lay down my life." And in John 18, 10 through 11, as the Roman guards come to capture Jesus, Peter actually does pull out his sword and he strikes a servant of the high priest. But Jesus tells him to put that sword away. And he heals the high priest. But again, Peter was all in all the time. But then Jesus is captured. And if any of you have been reading through the Easter story, you know how this goes. Jesus gets captured. He gets taken in. He gets flogged. He gets questioned. He gets all these things, and his disciples are confused. Not long before this, Jesus was riding into Jerusalem on a donkey. And people were laying down coats and palm branches and everything else, declaring the Messiah coming in, this kingly person. And his disciples were already talking about who's going to be the greatest in his kingdom that's coming. And Peter was ready to defend this kingdom and defend him to the death. And now Jesus is captured. And Peter's not the only one that's confused here. All the disciples are confused. They're bewildered. They don't understand what's happening. But then again in John 18, in chapter 25 through 27, Peter's standing around a fire in a courtyard. And people start to say, "I think I know who you are. You're one of Jesus' disciples." And Peter denies even knowing Jesus. Emphatically, he denies it. In fact, he calls curses down and says, "There's no way that I know him." And then, just as Jesus had predicted, the rooster crows after Peter has denied him 3 different times. Now let's stop there a moment and flip over to Judas. So Judas is another character that we see, another person that we see in the account of the Easter story. There's not really a lot told about Judas in the Gospels prior to this. In Luke 6, 12 through 16, when it talks about all the different apostles or disciples that are called, 12 disciples, Judas Iscariot is called out as the one who will later betray him. The only other time we really see him in the Gospels comes in the Gospel of John, chapter 12, 4 through 6, where it says, "But Judas, one of his disciples, he was who about to betray him, said, 'Why is this ointment not sold for 300 denarii to give to the poor?' It states that he said this not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. Having charge of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was in it." In this account, Mary Magdalene had come in and was washing Jesus' feet with her tears, and then she anoints him with this perfume on his feet. And this super costly perfume, and Judas says this is a waste. That's the only real thing we have. It's not a really uplifting verse about Judas. In fact, a lot of people look at Judas and they just look at him as the betrayer, right? I mean, he betrayed Jesus, and we'll get to that. But there's an interesting part about Judas that I think maybe we ought to consider. Why is Judas called Judas Iscariot? You might think that it's just a family name, surname, things like that, but there's a lot of historians that don't believe that. In fact, there's some scholars that believe that it's a corruption of the Latin word Sicarius. This would mean murderer or assassin. Now, at the on-take, you might think that this is something that was put back on Judas in later time, that as, folks wrote out the Gospels, that they said, oh, well, that Judas, he was a murderer at the end. But there's also some folks that believe that this is calling out that he was actually from a sect of Judaism that would be similar to the Sicarii, which would actually be a terroristic type sect. This would be very similar to the Zealots in later times. May have heard of some of them. But these sects would go around and perform these basically terroristic type acts, creating revolts, all these different things. We actually have some accounts of that even in the Bible, of talking about these little sects that would pop up and revolt and eventually dissipate. Now, why would they do that? These sects actually believed that the Messiah was only going to come as a military ruler. And you had all these different sects of Judaism, but this particular sect of Judaism believed that in order to get the Messiah to come, they would have to stir up this military event, and the Messiah would come in, and he would take out Rome. Again, let's think about this for a moment. What if that's the reason that Judas is named Iscariot? Well, how would this play out? Well, Judas wants Jesus to overthrow the Roman government. And in fact, that's a pretty universal amongst the disciples, amongst the Jews at the time, outside of Pharisees and the Sadducees and some folks that, were in fairly close with the government. But in general, the Jewish nation was hoping that the Messiah would be a political leader, and some very much hoping it could be that the Messiah would be a military leader. So let's think. Judas wanted Jesus to overthrow the Roman government. Now, Judas's understanding of the Messiah starts to get challenged even as soon as Jesus comes into Jerusalem. Why is this? Because Jesus came in on a donkey. If a king rode into town on a donkey, it was a sign of peace. If he rode into a town on a horse, it was a sign of war. But then Judas was looking for an opportunity to stir up a battle between the Messiah and Rome, or the leaders that were tied with Rome. In John 13:27, Jesus looks to Judas and he says, "What you do, do quickly." Now, the other Gospels talk about the devil coming in and things like that, and I believe all of these are accounting to the same thing. But what I want to point out to you for a moment, just to consider, I don't know how this really plays, but just to consider, what if Judas was really thinking that Jesus was this military Messiah, and he looks at him and says, "Do it quickly. Do what you must quickly." Then Judas goes and he leads this Roman cohort, this army, to the Messiah, hoping the Messiah is ready for battle. And in fact, you could even take that back to the fact that Judas, in this sect of Judaism, would have absolutely hated the Pharisees and Sadducees. And he would have been more than willing to play them into this whole game of drawing Rome to Jesus, to the Messiah. Now let's think about this for a moment, because if this is true, then how would this have all played out? Then Judas would have led the Romans to Jesus, expecting Jesus to defeat the Romans. But what would Judas have thought about? What would he have thought when he saw Jesus hanging on a cross? when he saw him dying? Would he have wanted the silver that he got in the first place? Sure, back in John it talked about him helping himself to the money bags for things or whatever else, but it's also well stated that some of these Jewish sects, these absolute radicals, didn't care much about money, period, because it was all Roman, and they just despised anything Roman. What would Judas have thought about his military Messiah that was allowing himself to be chained and carried off and beaten and bruised and battered and eventually crucified on a cross? It could have led him to a lot of things, right? And we eventually know that Judas actually took his own life. Now, I do want to pause here for a moment and make a first application. I don't know if this is exactly how this played out with Judas. I don't know all of his motivations. But could it be possible? Could Judas have been part of one of these radical sects that had these different ideologies, and these ideologies actually led him to his part in the crucifixion of Jesus, our Messiah? Led him in his part of God's plan. Now, if this is the case, then one of the first applications I have here is, could it be possible that we've misunderstood Judas's intentions? What if he thought he was helping out the Messiah's reign? And if that's possible, if it's possible that we could have misunderstood Judas's intentions, is it possible that we can misunderstand others' intentions as well? That we take others at face value without understanding their backgrounds, the motivation they have, the things that make them, let's say, tick. What if it would lead us to the wrong conclusions? What if we look at the things that play out in their lives and we have this expectation that we understand why it's happening, but we don't really know? What if we took the time to truly get to know them, to know those backgrounds, to know the things that really play out in their lives, and thus truly understand who they are and why they are where they are? But now let's get back here to this idea of two brothers. There's two brothers, two disciples, Peter and Judas, but there's a single problem that both of them are dealing with. Both of them denied Jesus. The other side of them denying Jesus is not simply that they just went off on their own way, but Jesus didn't turn out to be what either of them expected. One of the other common threads between Judas and Peter is most likely they thought the Messiah was truly going to rule. When he was led away in handcuffs, neither of them could understand what was going on. They both wanted Messiah to be a liberator, and now Jesus is hanging on a cross. God didn't work in the way they wanted and or expected him to work. But here's where the difference comes between the two of these people. In these accounts, we see that each decided on a very different path forward. Judas, in Matthew 27, it tells us, was filled with remorse. He went and he threw the silver back to the temple. And he went and he hung himself. Now, if you read in the first chapter of Acts, it sounds a little bit different, but I fully believe that these two stories are linked very closely. This field of blood that is talked about in both places that Judas eventually dies on. But I honestly don't think Judas could deal with himself, not because specifically that he couldn't stand that he took another person's life, but that he fully had anticipated Messiah to do something different. And when Jesus was crucified, it was all lost. But in John 21:15 through 17, we see that Jesus comes back and speaks to Peter. And he reinstates Peter. Jesus comes back, and Peter's actually back fishing again. And when Peter sees Jesus and understands and realizes who he is, he comes running up to him. In fact, he jumps out of the boat once again and swims and gets his way there and comes up to Jesus. And Jesus has kind of a tough message for him, because he asks him 3 times, the same 3 times that Peter has denied Jesus, he asks Peter 3 times, "Do you love me?" And he walks him back. And he reinstates him as the Peter that he spoke of in Matthew 16, where he says, "I will build my church on you, and the gates of hell will not overpower it." And we go on and we see Peter has this hugely powerful ministry throughout the book of Acts. So what are the differences and similarities here? Well, the similarities, God's plan didn't turn out the way either of these men had expected. They both, in a sense, denied Jesus. They both thought that he was going to do something, and whether the denial was because they intended to go ahead and bring the Roman government, in my humble opinion, or the denial was because this wasn't playing out the way they wanted and they don't know that Jesus is really who he is, they both denied. They both had a period of time where they were utterly lost. However, there were differences. One saw that when it didn't turn out, when God didn't play this thing out the way that they thought it should play out, Judas felt it was utterly hopeless, and the only thing he could see was to end his life. Yet Peter allowed for God's forgiveness and acceptance to come into his life. He saw that there was still hope, even though there was all this hopelessness, discouragement, misunderstanding, not sure what it was. He at least gave time to have this next chapter, this next leaf overturned. So, how do I see this applying today? Well, I think it applies hugely today. I mean, most of us are in a place that we didn't expect to be probably even just a month ago, right? With this whole pandemic and everything going on, there's economic issues, there's job issues, there's education issues, there's family stressors and things that come up with, being in places and away from other people and all sorts of different things. There's health concerns, there's all sorts of things that are not what we expected. So how many of us could say to God, why? This is not the way it's supposed to go. How many of us has had those deep questions and start to say, this isn't what I thought was going to happen? But if we look at these 2 men, we really have 2 paths, the same 2 paths they had laid out in front of them. Now, one is a path of hopelessness, and I hope we don't go down that, because hopelessness is a horrible place to be. And with that hopelessness, you have this inability to see through the darkness of the time that we're in. And you have these thoughts that God could never use me again. See, this was one of Judas's biggest mistakes. But then there's the side that Peter has, this willingness to give God time to act. See, Peter didn't understand what was going on right away. It took time. It rolled out. It laid out. The women came and told him about the empty tomb, and then Jesus appears, and over time this continues to roll out. But he realized also that whenever God called him, Peter was willing to repent. And he was also willing to allow God to work through him and his brokenness. Think about this for a second, how this would have prepared Peter for all the incredible things he did in Acts, right? Somebody comes up to Peter and says, "Oh, well, geez, you don't understand." And Peter says, "I may not understand, but let me tell you something. I knew Jesus personally, and I still denied him 3 times. But yet Jesus loved me enough to come back and still accept me, even as that person who denied him? I think Peter got a better understanding of what Jesus' love and his character is. And that's one of the things that I want to leave us here with today, is Jesus' character. In Luke 19:10, it says, "For the Son of Man, who is Jesus, has come to seek and save that which was lost." Jesus came here for the lost. This is one of the questions I like to ponder, and I would challenge you guys to ponder it as well. We don't know this, but what would have happened if Judas would have repented? My personal feeling is nobody is too far lost. Would he have gone through some level of chastisement the same way that Peter did whenever Jesus asked him 3 different times, "Peter, do you really love me?" Probably. But I know that Jesus came for the lost, and no one is too far lost. God's ready to forgive those who were once close and who denied him. And I think if we're honest, all of us can say that we've at least questioned, if not maybe at times fully denied, that God could really be in control of this situation. See, that was Judas's and Peter's problem, is they couldn't see how God could possibly work through this situation in a way that was different than they thought. So if you don't know Jesus, well, he's ready to welcome you home into his kingdom. However, if you did know Jesus and walked away, or in a sense denied him, he's ready to accept your confession and reinstate you, just the way he did Peter. And for those of us who do know Jesus, he wants to take each and every one of us into a deeper relationship with him and open new doors with ministry and other things. And he wants us to rely on him. He wants us to realize that even in the weird times that we're going through right now, that he's there, that he's in control, that he can be trusted. And even though it's rocky and we don't know what the next step's going to be, that he's going to be right there with us. And then that's enough. So I do want to end with just saying, if you would happen to be watching this and you want to know more about this, I have a few things. Obviously, we're in a different time right now. Who knows when you're watching this, but right now we're supposed to be separated for this whole COVID thing. But here's some things. If you know someone who has a close relationship or a deep relationship with Jesus Christ, go ahead and reach out to them and ask them about it. If you want to contact us here at Mercersburg Mennonite Church, we'd be happy to help as well. Or once all of this blows over and we're able to get back together and worship, come and join us or another biblical believing church and grow together. I want to thank you for taking this time to just think and ponder. Think about what it means to truly follow after, to truly rely on God. Think about the stress that both Judas and Peter went through during this time. Think about the incredible forgiveness that Jesus had for Peter. And I believe he would have had for Judas if Judas would not have taken his own life. And think about the incredible forgiveness he has for you and for me. Not only for when we turn away from this world and turn our lives towards him, but for all the times that we turn our eyes off of him and get caught up by this world or get pulled away by the sinful nature that we have or whatever else. I can honestly say just today, there have been different things that I just have to confess about the way that I've talked to even my family in this time, or just the things that I've been frustrated about or things like that. And Jesus wants to know that. And he wants us to use that as a way to draw closer to him, not further apart. I just want to leave you saying, I hope you have a blessed day. And I hope we can all draw closer to Jesus, not only currently, not only through this time, but as we walk together